So God has 3 plans for you, basically. I mean, you could say it in a whole variety of ways, but 3 categories. 1, God wants to draw you close to his heart so that you know his love and grace, and so that your faith trusts him and you walk with him every day. God wants to draw you close to his heart. 2nd, just like the skit that we just saw Jared and Joe share with us, God wants to shape you into the likeness of his Son, Jesus Christ. He wants to carve out the character of Jesus Christ in you so that you become like Jesus Christ. 3rd, God wants to use you for his mission. He wants to harness you up and shine through you so that his love is known to all the world. Those 3, got them? Draw your heart close to himself. Chisel your life so that the character in your heart is like Jesus Christ, and then harness you up so that you are a partner with him in his kingdom. So what does that have to do with the letter to the exiles in Babylon? Here it is. God uses our times of suffering and adversity, whether they are imputed upon us by the injustice or wrong of others, or whether it's my own foolish choices that brought it on. God uses adversity and suffering for all 3 of those things. That in the times of suffering and disappointment and sadness, I'm drawn to his heart. In the times of suffering and sadness, he shapes me like a potter with his hands on the soft clay. In the times of adversity and suffering, he gives me the opportunity to shine for him and to let my identity as his child in this world be known. So are you today in the midst of some adversity? Are you sad? Are you suffering? Is there disappointment in your life? God has a word of hope for us in the message he shared with the exiles enslaved in the country of Babylon. There's a man named Jay Rathman who was hunting deer in Northern California, and he had just climbed up a slope, a rocky gorge, and he raised his head above the crest of the hill when his right eye and his peripheral vision caught a slight movement, and just that fast, a rattler, quick, came right at his head. It missed him, skimmed his right ear, and the fangs of the rattler got caught on his sweater. And the momentum of the strike carried the body of the snake to land on his shoulder. And then the 4-foot snake started curling around his neck. He reached up as quick as he could behind the head of the snake, and the battle that he was in caused him to fall over backwards, and he was falling down a steep slope of gravel and lava rock, and his feet got hung up, and his head was below his feet, and he was stuck there looking into the eyes of this rattler, his fangs like, what are those knitting needles you ladies use? So he's looking into the eyes of this snake. And he takes his rifle that drug with him down the slope, and he reaches up and he pries the fangs of the snake off his sweater. But then he discovered that the snake still had just enough movement in the body to still have an attempt to strike him. So he counted 8 times the rattler tried to get him in his head. The nose of the snake 4 times struck his cheekbone right under his eye, but he was able to move his head so the fangs never got caught. And eventually, out of fear, he ended the snake's life by strangling it. He walks into the game warden's office with the rattlers hanging. He throws the rattlers on the game warden's desk and says, "I'd like to file a complaint about the wildlife in your territory." Does that ever happen to you? Not a strike of a rattler, but quick as a rattler strike, that your life turns in a moment. something happens and everything's upside down. Some adversity, like a cloud, comes over your life and everything is different from that moment. Maybe it's marital conflict that ends the relationship. Maybe it's the diagnosis of an illness. Maybe it's family dynamics that are conflicted. Maybe you lose your job. Maybe it's financial stress. Maybe it's someone precious to your heart that dies unexpectedly. And what do? How do you face the adversity? So Jeremiah was speaking a word to the people of God in about the year 620 BC to 587 BC. He warned them for 40 years about how God wanted them back, how God wanted them to come back to his heart, how God wanted them to walk in obedience to him and live in harmony with him and live according to his word. But the people mocked him. They desecrated the prophet. They threw dog and animal droppings at him when his heads are in stockades in the public square. They threw him in a pit. Nobody listened. So Babylon eventually defeated God's people and hauled them off into slavery in a far-off country. And if you were fortunate enough to survive, most of the people you knew and loved as neighbors and friends and family are gone. And so now you're wrestling with, is this my new normal? Is this how it's going to be now? Will I just be assimilated into the Babylonians? Is our identity as the people of God gone? And, oh God, how could you have let this happen? Never mind 40 years of disobedience, defiance, and rebellion. God, how could you let this happen to me? And then it dawns on you. It was your own rebellion, it was your own stubbornness, it was your own foolishness that drove you down this dead-end street. You're the problem. So adversity sometimes comes into our life. Disappointment, suffering, and struggle sometimes comes into our life because life is hard and the world is broken and there are no guarantees. But sometimes I'm the one that turns down the dead-end alley in a place that's almost impossible to turn around from. Now, how am I going to face that adversity? I think the letter that Jeremiah writes to the people in Babylon are reasons for us to hold hope. Let's see what we could learn. First, God says, I carried you to Babylon. You mean you let this happen? Yes, I let this happen. Romans 8:28 says, God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him, are called according to his purpose. It does not say all things are good. It does not say God causes all things. But in the midst of the dynamic of the circumstances, God's Spirit can be released to turn it for good for the sake of our relationship with him. God causes all things to work together for good. So God still has his hands on his people. Even as they were being defeated, God was bearing them to that far-off land. God still has his hand on them. He had not given up on them. And he called for them to seek him. And in the midst of that process, in the midst of the adversity, they sought him, and he was able to begin to shape their character. You know what happens for Laaveg when I face difficulty? Is my priorities get reset. And I realize the things in life that are incidental and non-essential, especially to my desire and my heartfelt mission to shine and live as a servant of Jesus Christ, I begin to process, well, this doesn't fit. And just like the skit we saw, the chisel comes out, and God says, you're right, it's got to go. So that's point number one. God carried them into exile. Therefore, God's hands is still on them, and he has not given up on them. The second thing is he says, settle in to patiently endure your adversity and suffering. I don't know about you, but when I'm in trouble and I pray for God to help, how quickly do you think I want God to deliver me? Immediately. And if an hour later nothing's changed, I'm already praying like, God, didn't you hear my prayer? Here's what God says: build a house. Go ahead and get married. In fact, let your sons and daughters marry. How long were they going to be there? How long was that going to be the reality for them? Settle in. Accept your punishment. Ask God what you could learn there. Third thing is, seek to be a blessing to the place God has put you. There are times where we're in circumstances or contexts or in relationships or working with people that is not easy for us. God says, seek to be a blessing and pray for the city in which you live. Pray for those co-workers that you struggle with. Pray about the people that are a thorn in your side. Pray for God to bless them. Seek to be a blessing. You ever heard this? Bloom where you're planted. It was Walt Disney that once said, "The flower that blooms in adversity is rare and most beautiful." The fourth thing God says is, don't diminish, multiply, and grow. Sometimes when I face difficulty, I shrink back, or I conclude something about my self-worth or my confidence that is not true based on what God says about me. Don't shrivel up. Don't shrink back. Multiply. Grow. Continue to live, God says. Then he says, don't listen to the lies. When you and I are going through something hard, any philosophy sounds attractive. And sometimes we even question this book. We question the promises. We question the presence of God because what we're going through is so hard. God says, don't listen to the philosophies of the world. Don't listen to the lies. Come back to my word. Come back to my promises. Call on me. Seek me. And the last one, the bottom line is, God says, I'm going to gather you. I'm going to bring you home. That's what he says. Someday I'm going to bring you home. So what are some takeaways then for us? That was the word to the exiles. What are some takeaways for us then? I would say this. How do we face adversity and disappointment? First, remember God will never abandon or forsake you. Second, the darker the adversity, the brighter we are to shine. That's a hard one too. The darker the adversity, the brighter we are to shine. It's an opportunity for those around us to see who we belong to see where our strength comes, to see who is the source of our life and light and love. So instead of being swallowed by the darkness, shine brighter. The only way you and I can do that is if our hearts are in tune with the God who gives us life. Third, persevere. Don't give up. Sometimes God does not lift us out of the context of those circumstances. Sometimes God does not miraculously deliver us from whatever adversity we're facing or the suffering that we're enduring. Sometimes God just pours the presence of his Spirit into us to give us the inner strength to push through. Don't give up. Persevere. Keep going. Also, keep your heart open to what God would want to teach you. Even make that your prayer in the midst of the suffering. Lord, make me like Jesus Christ. Show me what you want to change. Show me how you want me to become like you. Show me the path forward. Teach me in this time. God colors our darkness with his presence. Does that sound like an oxymoron? Sounds like a moron is speaking. No, it's an oxymoron. God colors our darkness. One theologian said, hearkening back to the days where clipper ships, sailing ships were crossing the seas, he said, it's an exhilarating thing to be tied to the mast of a sailing ship going through a storm, dark clouds rolling, thunder booming, lightning striking, waves crashing the side of the boat, spray into your face. If the captain guarantees you are going to make it safely to harbor. Keep trusting the promises of God to see the future that God has said will be yours. You're not going to be forever in this context. Persevere, but by faith, keep walking toward the promises that God says are yours. And finally, remember that Jesus Christ has suffered too. So the full spectrum of the emotions that you and I deal with as we go through those tough times, Jesus understands. Share your heart with him. Are you sad? Why not tell him? Are you angry? Go ahead and tell him. Are you guilty, ashamed? Dump that. Do you need hope? Ask him to give it to you. You see, Jesus Christ went to the cross and was raised from the dead. He's overcome. And we are more than conquerors through Jesus Christ who loves us. Chuck Swindoll, in his book, The Quest for Character, tells a story about a woman named Edith who was the mother of 8 children. She lived in Darlington, Massachusetts. She had been visiting on a Saturday afternoon at the neighbor's house, and when she came home, her 5 youngest children she knew were at her house, and she wondered, what are those 5 children up to? Because it's too quiet in my house. You ever had moments like that, Mom, where you're coming home and you're going, it's just too quiet here. So she peeks through the screen door and she sees her 5 youngest children huddled in the living room, concentrating on something. So she opens the door, she comes into the living room, and she looks to see what the children are so occupied with. And she sees 5 baby skunks. At the top of her lungs, she says, "Children, run!" And each child picked up a skunk and ran. Here's my problem, maybe yours too. I want God to deliver me. I want the adversity to stop. I want the suffering to stop, but I want to take the skunk with me. Let go of the skunk. Let go of the skunk. Ask the Lord to deliver you. What 3 things are in God's plan for you? He wants to draw you close to his heart. He wants to shape your character to be like Jesus Christ. And he wants to harness you up to shine with his love in the mission of God in this world. So like Paul, we say, I press on for the goal of the prize of the upward call of God in Jesus Christ. Amen.